So welcome everyone. I was just saying my name is Erica Smith from the University of Calgary, and it's my pleasure to be co-leading this series of sessions and facilitating them with Michelle Yeoh, who is the director of the Mokakiiks Center for Scholarship of Teaching and Learning at Mount Royal University across the river in Calgary. And we are just really thrilled to have you all here today and also to welcome Mills Kelly for our final of these three sessions to talk about leadership and growing your leadership capacity in scholarship of teaching and learning. In order to start things off in a good way today, and in a commitment to truth and reconciliation, we also wanted to acknowledge the land that Michelle and I are joining today from in the Calgary area. And it's a land that is very much steeped in history and community. And we wanted to acknowledge that it's a storied place, that we're coming from the Treaty 7 region. And basically, we have just so many amazing colleagues, relationships where we've built a lot of land-based learning and learning from our colleagues with Indigenous connections. And it's just been a really rich time in terms of that process. We are transitioning. I've picked a photo here of the land in the Rocky Mountain area, showing that this is actually in the middle of summer. So showing that we have snow even in the midst. I know there was a snowfall warning in Banff actually just this past week. And so we wanted to make a tribute to the land, the territory that runs from the Sweetgrass Hills along the 49th parallel and then along the Rocky Mountains to the foothills where the Bow and the Elbow River meet. And that's the traditional Blackfoot name of the city of Calgary is Mokinstis. So both Michelle and I would like to pay tribute to and acknowledge the traditional territories of the people of Treaty 7, which include the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprised of the Siksika, the Piikani, the Kainai First Nations, the Tsuut'ina First Nation, and the Stoney Nakoda, including Chiniki, Bears Paw, and Goodstoney First Nations. And the city of Calgary is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, Districts 5 and 6. And I'll pass the virtual microphone over to Michelle now.
Thanks very much, Erica. I feel like you do all the heavy lifting getting us started, so thank you for doing that again. Yeah, Michelle Yeoh, I think Erica mentioned I am director of the Mokakiiks Center for SoTL at Mount Royal. I think I forget to introduce myself every time, so now I have. And just to, probably many of you have attended some of these sessions before. This is our second season, the third session in the second season. We started this a couple of years ago with colleagues at the Taylor Institute, and Cherie Wilmer here at Mount Royal University was a big driver behind the concept for this, where we really wanted to offer something that was both really brought in colleagues from around the world, that opportunity to connect and have conversations, and also to maybe move beyond some of the usual kind of getting started in SoTL types of sessions that are really critically important, but there I think a need for to push a little bit at the edges of where SoTL is going, and some of the more new and different work that's being done. So that's our intention. We do have a I wanted to put in the chat, if you haven't caught all of the previous sessions, this is the link to a page where you can view all the previous recordings if you're interested. So both seasons. And with that, I'd like to introduce Dr. Mills Kelly, who is my friend and colleague from the US. We were just talking about all the current world events and everything that we're all kind of facing. And so this is a wonderful opportunity to to have some positive space. And Mills, I've known Mills for about 5 years when I worked with him at the International Society for Scholarship of Teaching and Learning. He's a professor, recently retired, of history at George Mason University, and has been a SoTL practitioner since the late 1990s. So I think in Sarah Bonnell and her colleagues' terms is definitely a sort of a Gen Zero SoTL practitioner. When he was a Pew National Fellow with the Carnegie Academy for Scholarship of Teaching and Learning, he's written widely on SoTL topics over the years, and in 2019 was the president of the International Society for Scholarship of Teaching and Learning. And I can certainly credit Mills for drawing me into that organization. He's currently working on a book on the history of SoTL in history, teaching, and learning. And with that, Mills, I will pass it over to you. Thank you for being here with us.
Well, Michelle, thank you so much. Erica as well, thank you. And thanks everybody for being here today. It's great to see such an international group. I'm actually coming to you from Laguna Beach, California, where we had a nice earthquake yesterday. It is earthquake prone territory. It wasn't a big one, but I live on the east coast of the US, so it's always a little exciting to experience an earthquake. People here are a little blasé about the small ones. They say, "Oh, that was an earthquake," and I was thinking, ah. But so I'm here actually researching. I'm working on two books simultaneously, which is never a great plan. But that's, I'm retired now, so I can find the space and time to do that. Um, Michelle and I mentioned in the chat, go back a little further than 5 years, and it's but my work in SoTL actually goes back a very long way. I started doing this kind of work before I even knew what it was in the mid 1990s, and which dates me, of course. But the when I moved, I was doing a research project about how my students were learning with technology, which in those days we called the World Wide Web. And I moved to my first tenure track job was at Texas Tech University, and that the teaching center controlled faculty websites because so few faculty had websites in the late 1990s that seemed appropriate for the teaching center to control it. And so you had to meet with the director of the teaching center, who was an assistant provost, and she asked me, as a good administrator should, she asked me, so tell me something that you're working on. And I was very excited about the classroom research project I was doing. And so I told her about it, and she said, "Oh, that's a very interesting scholarship of teaching and learning project." And I never heard those four words put together in a string like that before. And I recognized academic jargon when I heard it, and I didn't want to seem ignorant. So I said, "What is the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning?" And she told me, and then she reached into a file drawer and pulled out an application and said, "The Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching is looking for people like you, and so you should apply for this fellowship." And I was a brand new assistant professor. So of course and she was an assistant provost. So of course I applied. And I was fortunate enough to be accepted into the second cohort of Carnegie Scholars. And that was in 1998. And my career in SoTL really took off after that. And Rosalind Smith is really the person who pushed me into this work well, she didn't push me. She sort of opened a file in front of me and said, "Would you like this?" And, I'm going to come back to that moment because I'm going to talk about leadership in the scholarship of teaching and learning. And Rosalind, in that moment, exemplified one of the styles of leadership that I think is so important for this work. So I'm going to share my slides now. See how I do. It's been a while since I had to share because I don't do as much Zooming now. It's one of the benefits of being retired is Zooming less. Okay, so there are there to my mind, there are three possible roles for leadership in the scholarship of teaching and learning. And I'm going to talk about the first and the third primarily, what it looks like to lead as an individual, and what it looks like to lead as an administrator like Rosalind. And before I go too deep into this talk, I just want to acknowledge that, as Michelle said, these are very interesting times for those of you who are coming from the United States. They're extremely interesting and challenging, of course. The Research Center, just to give you some context, the Research Center that I directed for for 4 years until 2 years ago, so through the pandemic, just had almost $1 million worth of research funding pulled by the the Department of Government Efficiency, as Elon Musk would have it, and so. Fortunately, during the pandemic, we had decided to diversify our grant portfolio. So while the loss of that very large amount of money was devastating, it wasn't career ending for the center that I directed. So we're going to navigate our way through this, but at the same time, people are going to lose their jobs, and some of the work just simply won't be done. And at the moment in the United States, there's really no end in sight for these kinds of problems, and so it's a particularly difficult moment, and I just want to acknowledge that, and that it ripples out all around the world. And so it just this is where we are, and I think that some of the things I'm going to talk about today will help us as we try to imagine how we're going to navigate our way through the next several years. So there's been a lot of work done on leadership in the scholarship of teaching and learning. And in particular, I want to highlight the work of Nicola Simmons, who has spent a good part of her career thinking about these kinds of issues and has published widely on them. And she likes this particular graphic that appears in a number of her publications and presentations. And it's not new now, it's been around. She's used this for many years, but I think it really does a nice job of explaining how we fit as SoTL scholars and where we can find points of leverage for demonstrating leadership. So either as an individual thinking about their own classroom research, in some departmental or program-wide role, more institutionally, perhaps in a dean's position or a provost position like Rosalind, or at the national or international level. And so I'm going to focus primarily on the micro and the macro today. The piece that doesn't show up a lot in the literature on leadership in SoTL is the what I would call the dimension of values. And I have been a proponent of values-driven leadership really since the beginning of my teaching career, and even before that, because I was a consultant in higher education, and my mentor in that work was a really big proponent of values-driven approaches to the work that we did. And so we spent a lot of time in my consulting firm talking about it, and then I got into my doctoral program, and we spent exactly no time talking about how our values would have anything to do with the research that we were doing or the teaching that we were engaged in with our students. And that really bothered me because I'd come from this environment, this corporate environment, where values were so centered in all of our work. And it just seemed to be completely absent from the work that I wanted to do in higher education. And other than very brief discussions about catching students when they plagiarized or they cheated. And that, to me, that wasn't really about values. That was more about discipline. And so today I want to talk a good bit about values. And I think that in talking about values, it helps us to step back from the chaos of the world at the moment and really focus on the things that matter to us. And so I gave a workshop at the Banff Institute or Symposium on the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning this past November, in which I talked about some of these kinds of questions. And in the workshop, I asked people to stop and make lists of possible answers to these questions. And so I would encourage you later to reflect on some of these questions and just sit down and do a little journaling or a little writing, a little free writing about what are my values and how do those values drive the work that I'm doing, the questions that I ask in my SoTL research, the choices that I make about who I work with and who I don't, and also choices about how I am going to disseminate the findings that I'm coming up with and who I'll disseminate them with. Am I going to disseminate them with colleagues? Am I going to disseminate them with my students as partners in the research? And why are those choices important to me? In other words, who am I? Which is a question that I think we don't ask often enough in leadership. And when we talk about leadership, we tend to talk about strategies and resources and institutional arrangements. And I would like to suggest that for any of those strategies or allocations of resources or institutional arrangements to work, we have to really know who we are and what we care about and how that is something that can benefit our students. So, so what does this look like what does values-driven leadership look like in the scholarship of teaching and learning as an individual, as somebody who's new or established in the field, as someone in an institutional role with resources or influence, who has the kind of opportunity to affect career trajectories of faculty or of entire departments. I'll mention, just to highlight Rosalind Smith's work again at Texas Tech University, one of the things that she did that so impressed me was that in my second year there, she established a departmental teaching award and as opposed to an individual teaching award. And because her view was that excellent teaching arose out of departmental collaboration and that, of course, individuals did great things in their classrooms, but that for students to really benefit, it had to be department wide. And so the award was it was a real award. The first award was in 1999 and it was $25,000 US. And so today, I guess that would be more like $35,000, something like that. And the award was given to the department to use as it chose. And the first winner of that award was the Department of Soil Sciences. Texas Tech University has a large agricultural research program, and the Department of Soil Sciences won the first award. And with that money, which they could have just chopped up and given out to faculty members or out to graduate students as stipends or research travel money, instead they used it to renovate a storage space into a lounge for their MA and PhD students so that the students would have a place to congregate finally. And I think that that was evidence that the award had been given wisely to that department. So, as I mentioned, there's been a fair amount of research over the last 15 years or so about leadership in the classroom. And this essay by Katrina Martinson, Torgny Roja, and I'm sorry, I've forgotten Olson's first name now, is one that I read many years ago. And it just made me smile because I love this particular phrase that despite attempts made by both internal stakeholders, such as individual academics, heads of departments and deans, and by external stakeholders, such as governments and other policymakers, to influence practices in higher education, teaching mostly remains unaffected. And that's because, as we know, so many of our colleagues are pretty set in their ways when it comes to teaching, and students are very happy to point that out when you ask them. And so in this moment of really dynamic change, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the dynamism of change toward the end of my talk today. We're seeing challenges to that technologically driven challenges to that kind of resistance to change, and so it's going to be, I think, interesting to see how long this particular view of teaching holds up. So where do my values come from? Well, they come from this place. which is an elementary school in Siem Reap, Cambodia, where I did some volunteer work in 2007. And this school, which was built by the French colonial administration just after the Second World War, was had the capacity for 1,100 students. And so if you know Cambodia at all, Siem Reap is where Angkor Wat is nearby, so it's where the hotels are for the people visiting Angkor Wat. And so the school has a capacity of 1,100 students, and they had 2,300 students and enrolled in the school. And if you look at the classroom image on the right, it really could be any elementary school classroom anywhere in the world with the drawings on the walls and the student art. The alphabet was on the front of the room, and the students in their uniforms writing in their books. And the big difference is that these classrooms all had three walls instead of four, because of the tropical environment. And so I got to know the principal of this school quite well, and I asked him once what his philosophy of leadership was, and he said, it's very simple. Um, he said, we have a problem here because our school facility only has capacity for slightly less than half of the students, and so they can only attend half a day instead of a full day, and at least 100 of them have to be at recess at any given moment because otherwise there's no place for them to sit. And he said, so I've thought about it a lot, and my first goal is that all of my students should be safe. My second goal is that all of my students should be healthy. And my third is that they should learn what we hope they'll learn. And then he said, I want to emphasize that safe, healthy come first, and that learning comes third. And in the situation in Cambodia, this makes a lot of sense because, for one thing, children in most of Cambodia can't go and play in the forest because of the demining work following the wars in the 60s and 70s is still largely incomplete, and so landmines are a tremendous problem there. And so he, by focusing on the health and the safety of his children, he was then able to turn to the actual learning. And this is really counter to the kind of neoliberal narrative in the global North about being able to assess student learning objectives. Here in the United States, um, in my home state of Virginia, the tests that the students have to take are the standards of learning, which comes out as the acronym is SOL, which of course we all chuckled at when we were informed that this would be the acronym. But his values-driven approach to leadership in this very challenging situation meant that his students were going to have the opportunity to learn. And that's a lot more difficult to measure on a standardized test. And so I thought a lot about his approach and eventually uh, morphed it a little bit so that it works for me. Um, and so when I go, or I say go, I'm getting used to being retired. And so now I have to say when I went into my classrooms, um, on the first day, my students were often quite surprised when I told them that this is what, in order of priority, we were going to think about in whichever class I happened to be teaching. And that is that on every given day, that everyone would be safe, that everyone would be healthy, and that we would learn interesting things that we can apply in multiple domains. And I'm a historian, and so we talked a lot about how learning about the past could be applied across multiple domains, and that we would bring our humanity to class every single day. That this was the thing that was non-negotiable with me, is that they could be having a bad day, but they still had to bring their humanity with them. And then we would talk about what that looked like. And so a lot of the SoTL research that I did in my career was really focused on thinking about how to measure the point 0.3 and point 0.4 because those are much more measurable. And point 0.3 was, of course, the most measurable of all. But it was point 0.4 that really engendered the most intense conversations with my students because they were enrolled in a course in the humanities. And so what would that look like to bring their humanity to class every day? And and I would tell them that I was a SoTL scholar and that I was struggling with, how would we measure what that looked like? And they were full of ideas for thinking about that. So it really changed the environment in my courses. And students would say to me often, this wasn't what I expected in a history class. And I would say, well, what did you expect? And their response was often, well, I thought, we were going to have to memorize a lot of names and dates and be able to regurgitate that on an exam. I didn't think we were going to talk so much about humanity. And I said, well, it is a humanities class. Um, and so if you think about your own values, then I think it's useful to ask, what would it look like to formulate your SoTL research based on your values? Rather than on answering some um, kind of results-driven question. And if so, would you ask different questions? And would you evaluate your findings differently, given the fact that you've driven that research out of your own values? So that's at the classroom level. And so then what does it look like at the institutional level? And again, to quote Nicola Simmons and many others, in a piece that Simmons and Taylor published in 2019, they wrote that the gap between the practice of individual academics based on the ideal of the scholarship of teaching and learning, improving student learning, and the institutional infrastructure and leadership to support that work is an ongoing challenge to the development of the field. And this is kind of stating the obvious. Those of us engaged in SoTL work all know this, that institutional resources and priorities are often really misaligned with statements of institutional mission or values. We're an institution that values all students. We're an institution that promotes learning for everyone. And then you look at the way that the institution is organized and the way that resources are spread across the institution, and the misalignment is often pretty obvious. So this is the photo from the immediate aftermath of the pandemic at the research center that I directed, the Roy Rosenzweig Center for History and New Media. You can see we're still mostly masked in the photo because it was as people had just gotten vaccinated. And when I took over the center in 2019, in the fall of 2019, of course, I had no idea that we would have a pandemic because none of us could anticipate that. And so I had told my team there, which was a mixture of faculty, staff, graduate students, and undergraduate students, that I told them on the first day, this is my value structure about safe, healthy, and then doing very interesting work. And I think they were a little surprised. I think they expected me to talk about funding priorities or something like that. And so I said to them, my first goal is that everyone will be safe. And we were challenged right away because about 4 weeks into my tenure as the leader of the center, the university's emergency response system sent out an active shooter text in error. We did not have an active shooter, but we spent 7 minutes believing that we did. The person who sent the text in error ended up having to find another job because the entire university went into panic mode. And as you probably know, in the United States, getting an active shooter text is not out of the ordinary, unfortunately. And so I spent that 7 minutes getting people under their desks and making sure all the doors were locked and all of that and all the things you're supposed to do. And then we got the all clear. And afterwards, I can't tell you how many people on my team came to me to say, when you said safe, I didn't really think about that, but now I'm thinking about it. And so we talked about what our response was and how we would possibly change some of the locking mechanisms on our doors and that sort of thing. And so that was number one. Number two, everyone will be healthy. And of course, we had a pandemic. And I'm happy to say that my team navigated the pandemic with only some minor cases of COVID. But the bigger challenge was keeping them psychologically healthy, especially the graduate students who were often trapped in very small apartments and feeling incredibly isolated So I spent, I would say 8 hours a day, 9 hours a day on Zoom, mostly with the students, just to make sure that they were okay. Um, I told them in my first speech that then once safe and healthy, we would do interesting work that drove the field forward. And I'm proud to say that that really happened during my 4 years. Lots of really amazing things occurred, and that we would all bring our humanity to work every single day. And I made it clear that this was a non-negotiable for me, and so actually I had to encourage two members of the team that I inherited to find other roles within the university because they weren't able to really follow through on number four on a consistent basis. I mean, nobody's perfect, but they were, I would say, fairly inconsistent. So we really did the work based on these kinds of values. So that was me. Um, so, sorry. Um, I have the wrong title on this slide, but if you're in an institutional leadership role, what would it look like to facilitate SoTL research based on a set of shared values? Um, would your colleagues and the people that you're working with ask different questions if they're focused on their shared values? And would they evaluate their findings differently? And I would add, how can we as institutional leaders at that macro level that Nicola's graphic talked about, how can we align institutional resources and priorities around those values instead of having that misalignment that I talked about earlier? So just to give you an example of how I spent some time on that a number of years ago at George Mason University. I had sort of two opportunities to engage in closer alignment of values and resources at the institution. And one was I was part of a team of 10 people that established an undergraduate research program at the university, which has gone on to be really an award-winning program. And we did that. There was a group of associate deans and department heads, and we did that because the university had talked for years about wanting to promote groundbreaking research by undergraduate students, not just graduate students. And there was no evidence at the university that that was happening in a coordinated way. And individual faculty members, a few individual departments were doing that kind of work, but by and large, it was just a nice statement in the marketing materials for the university. And so this effort arose out of a lunch that several other of colleagues of mine had where they expressed their personal frustration about this misalignment, and so they gathered together a team of 10 people. I was really happy to have been invited, and over the course of about a year and a half, we formulated this undergraduate research program, and then had to convince the board of trustees to set aside funding for that. First, we had to convince the provost, and then once the provost was on board, we were able to convince the board of trustees to set aside funding for that, which was primarily hiring staff and providing space and stipends for students. But because a number of us in that startup team really cared about the scholarship of teaching and learning, we also insisted that there would be money set aside for faculty to do SoTL work with students to evaluate what was actually happening in the program. And that was actually, there was less money allocated to that than I would have preferred, but there was some, and the results of that really helped drive some change in the first 2 or 3 years of the effort. And now, as I say, it's gone on to be really an award-winning undergraduate research program. So that's one point of leverage. But the one that I think really made the biggest difference was that the university went through its every 10-year strategic planning process a number of years ago, and a colleague of mine in the provost's office who had been part of that undergraduate research startup, she was put in charge of the quote the teaching pillar in the strategic plan, and we decided that since nobody really seemed in the senior administration seemed to be as interested in the teaching pillar as they should have been, given that that's really what the university is there for. Um, we had kind of had free reign, and so we wrote that pillar around the scholarship of teaching and learning and the principles of the scholarship of teaching and learning, and it kind of passed on through the process and became one of the pillars of the university's strategic plan. And then she, because she was an associate provost, was in a position to say, okay, now we need the resources because the Board of Trustees has adopted this as a pillar. So where's the money? And where that money went into was a huge expansion of the teaching center at George Mason, which then started sponsoring an annual kind of mini SoTL conference on campus just for George Mason faculty, staff, and students. And so that's kept SoTL alive on our campus over the years. So again, it's an inflection point. And I'd like to suggest that those of us who have or have had the opportunity to be at one of those inflection points, like the director of the Mokakiiks Center or at the Taylor Institute or whatever institute you happen to be at or whatever role you have, it's about thinking about the student population and the community that your university serves, but it's also about thinking about values and how we can write those values into the work. So that's those are 2 points. But I also want to take just a minute to address what I would call the AI elephant in the room, because at this moment in higher education, we can't really think about much without also including some sort of conversation about what these large language models are beginning to make possible and take away. And I gave a lecture at St. Louis University 2 weeks ago on at the Walter Ong Center on the role of AI in the humanities. And so I just want to make a couple of points about this that I think are worth thinking about in SoTL. So these large language models are very good at a number of things. They're really good at summarizing and editing. Um, they're excellent at writing code. The computer science program at my university, which had just been growing and growing and growing and growing. This past year, for the first time, they saw a reduction in the number of applications for their undergraduate major. And that's because young people have seen that these AI models are taking away the entry-level coding jobs. And so they're thinking, well, how else might I apply my interest in technology? Uh, the large language models are also very good about connecting ideas across domains. They can read across millions and millions of words in seconds and then propose possible connections that weren't so obvious to us. Um, they have a lot to offer in terms of the kind of close reading that we value in the humanities and finding uh, really interesting points. I asked Claude AI not long ago. I said that I said to the model, because Claude is pretty conversational, and I said to the model, so Karl Marx in his career published something in the vicinity of 4.5 million words between his formal writings, his polemics, his political pamphlets, his journalism, and then his personal correspondence. Comes out to about 4.5 million words. And how long would it take you, Claude, to analyze those 4.5 million words and then come up with a list of ideas that Marx be, had begun to develop, but then stopped? Because that's a really interesting question for a Marx scholar is what were the things that Marx began working on, or any person you might be examining began working on and then abandoned? It doesn't answer why, but it begins, opens the door to some really interesting analysis. And Claude's response was, given the volume of words, it would take me about 15 seconds. So um, that's a that's a thing that we can take advantage of. And then I would say that the AI models are they're increasingly good at certain kinds of writing. They write really excellent marketing text. They write good strategic plans. That sort of thing. Product pitches, so that they were developed with commercial application in mind. What they're terrible at is writing poetry. Michelle, I'm sure, is chuckling because she is a poet, and some of the rest of you may be poets. I at the Banff Symposium, which if you haven't attended, I strongly encourage as a multiple year attendee. One of the wonderful things that Michelle has organized is a pop-up poetry event with two poets from Mount Royal University, and so I asked Richard Harrison, one of the two, to write me a poem about backpacking in the mountains, which is a personal it's the thing I spent a lot of time doing. And so Richard said to me, well, so I have a poem, but it may not quite be what you had in mind because it's kind of short. So let me know if you want something longer. And I'm terrible at memorizing poetry, but because this one is very short, I will quote it to you. And that is that in the mountains, a mind becomes a heart. And that really sums up, in the way that poets can, that really sums up the experience of backpacking in the mountains. So in the last class that I taught, which was about technology in the humanities, I asked my students to take the AI of their choice and ask it to write them a poem on whatever they wanted. And there was a tremendous amount of chuckling in the room because the poetry was really bad, really bad. And I asked it to write me, I asked, I think it might have been Gemini, to write a poem about backpacking in the mountains. And so it gave me a five stanza rhyming poem about backpacking that any competent high school, like 15-year-old poet could have written. And so I said, okay, but I want a poem that doesn't rhyme. So no rhyming. And so it gave me a poem that rhymes. And and so I said, insisted, please, no rhyming. And I got a poem that rhymes because in its internal algorithmic logic world, poetry rhymes. So it's going to be a long time before AIs are writing poetry that poets would consider poetry. Here's what AI is bad at, and I would like to submit always will be bad at. Algorithms are incapable of embodied experience because they are embodied, not or non-embodied algorithms. They have no sense of place. At the beginning of this talk, Erica provided us with a land acknowledgement, and that land acknowledgement is rooted in placeness. And in particular, for Indigenous people, the connection between their worldview and place is inextricable. And algorithms are incapable and will always be incapable of understanding that kind of placeness. And so AIs are just simply not going to be able to do that. And they cannot connect embodied knowledge or a sense of place to knowledge. And so, I think here about the work of Keith Basso, an anthropologist who spent most of his career working with the Western Band of Apache in Arizona. And Basso's really important book, Wisdom Sits in Places, which if you haven't read, I highly recommend, is about the Apache sense of placeness and its connection to knowledge and understanding of the world. And algorithmic models simply aren't going to be able to do that. And so, um, if that's given that that's true, how do we there's a good typo for you. How do we think about, not make think, but how do we think about student learning in this particular moment? And so in our work in the scholarship of teaching and learning, how are we going to shift our perspective based on the fact that our students are pretty, not universally, but pretty wholeheartedly embracing AI models as a time saver, as a research partner, as a writing partner, sometimes as a friend. And so how are we gonna think about student learning in this moment? What questions do we need to ask now, and how are those questions going to be different given the fact that AI has pushed itself into everything that we do? And then how do we demonstrate leadership as individual scholars in SoTL or as decision makers? And how do we demonstrate that leadership in ways that are a little different than they might, if I'd given this talk 3 years ago, it would have been a different set of questions. And so with that, we'll turn to questions and comments, and I'm going to stop screen sharing so that I can see everybody.
Thank you so much, Nils. Really interesting presentation and so many points to generate discussion. And so I think there was a preference last time for us to turn the recording off for the discussion part so that folks could feel comfortable asking questions that weren't recorded. So I'll just go ahead and do that now. And then we can open up the questions either in chat or if you'd like to put up your hand and use audio. And thank you so much again